It's 1917. The Western Front is a stalemate between Germany and Austria-Hungary, but mainly the Germans versus Britain and France. It's becoming clear that the British and the French are doing a little bit better, but on the other side of things, on the Eastern Front, the Germans are beating the Russians. And the Russians have a problem because let's remember the Russians were behind everybody else when it comes to industrialization. They did not industrialize nearly as successfully as Western Europe had. And so, as the war is going on, there's food protests going on, there's protests against the war, there's mutinies within the army, there's demonstrations in the major cities throughout. I mean, the big issues people want peace. I mean, there isn't any, the war is not good. They're literally sending soldiers to the front lines without guns when everybody else obviously has guns. It's not good for them. There's significant land issues. The nobles still had a lot of power, and so that is still an issue that they're still really dealing with the um, effects of the emancipations of the serfs, and the serfs still not really having full-fledged freedom with that. And three, there's no food. There's no food, and so the Tsar has a problem. The Tsar has a fundamental problem, and he ends up leaving the throne in March. He ends up leaving the throne in March, and it's seen as more or less an incomplete revolution because there are two groups of power at this point who are basically vying for power. Two groups is vying for power. The first one is led by a guy named Alexander Kerensky. He puts in a new government, a provisional government. It is a liberal government by all. It's very similar to what you'd see in basically that had been in Europe at this time. He gets rid of the Tsar's police, freedom of speech, press. You can associate with whomever you want. Abolish discrimination laws against ethnic and religious groups, primarily the Jews. And here's two of the things he doesn't do. He doesn't take on the war, because he stays in the war, and he doesn't take on the land reform. And what he says is that they cannot take on those challenges until they are the actual government, and the actual government's in place, and no longer provisional government. Provisional government's just like a placeholder kind of thing. Meanwhile, there's another group of people. If you remember back to the group of people who organize those trade workers, they become more and more a radical union, basically. But they're all over the place. They're local councils of trade workers, basically forming together, and those are what are known as Soviets. Those Soviets are gaining more and more power. Over time, it becomes an influential figure. That guy's name is Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin becomes the leader of the Bolsheviks, which is the radical wing of the Social Democratic Party. Small minority of the revolutionary working class, and he is going to call for the withdrawal from the war, very different than what Kerensky did, and transfer those powers to the Soviets. Now, Lenin he had grown up in Russia, became a believer in Karl Marx's theories, with a slight difference that we'll talk about in a second, and he had been living in Switzerland. Now, police had arrested his older brother who had said they were on a path to try to overthrow the Tsar, and they ended up hanging him, Lenin's brother, in 1887. Well, that puts Lenin on the outs with the Tsar because he just doesn't see eye to eye with him. And Lenin over time here sees a vehicle to try to bring Russia to equal power of the rest of the world, that their party, that Bolshevik party, is going to serve as a vehicle to move to this socialist Marxist society that Karl Marx and Engels had envisioned. The Germans know this, and the Germans put Lenin on a train and send him back to Russia, and that destabilizes Russia and is going to cause Russia to eventually pull out of the war. So, as we move forward here, so the March Revolution doesn't complete the revolution. The March Revolution continues forward. As it continues forward, Lenin is amazing at consolidating power. And the Bolsheviks gain control of the Soviets over time. And as they gain control of the Soviets over time, with all the workers and all the peasants fed up with the war, no food, and the fact that Kerensky's government isn't taking on land reforms, They do the November Revolution, which happens in 1970. You'll also see it called the October Revolution at times because it happens in the early parts of November, so it really depends on how you do it. And they are going to, it's a bloodless coup. It's a bloodless coup, and Lenin is now in power. They're quickly going to establish Leninism, which you take Marx's beliefs. Remember, Marxists thought, and so Lenin and Marx here disagree. Marx thought the proletariat of the people would rise up and be the key. Well, think about this. Lenin agrees with that. The people are going to rise up. The Soviets have risen up. Those were the people. The Soviets have risen up. However, Lenin disagrees with that. The fact Marx is no leader. Lenin says you need a leader. And it just so happens, oh, Lenin would be that person. So to give you a little bit more of the background here, in September, Lenin gets control of the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks and instructs them to do an armed insurrection against the provisional government. And on the night of November 6th, they storm the Winter Palace, and by the afternoon of November 7th, they're in power. No guns were fired, though. So it's a bloodless coup. Lenin's thing the entire time had been peace, land, and bread. Hey, we're going to pull out of the war. We're going to work on land reforms, and we're going to get people food. Well, those were the problems of Russia. And when he's working directly on those problems, Lenin's message appealed to the people. No question about that. That the proletariat was going to rise up. In this case, the Soviets are going to rise up and gain control, and their leader will be Lenin. One of the first things he does is sign the treaty to get them out of the war. Signs the treaty. It's somewhat humiliating, but it's peace. Russia's going to lose a third of its land. You can see here what they lose. They're going to lose a quarter or so of their population. And it is going to lead to civil war in Russia. We don't need to go into all the details of the civil war. There will be the whites and the reds, and it's going to go on for a while. What you should realize is that the Soviets are here to stay. Those Soviets and the Communist, or what will eventually become the Communist Party in Russia, are here to stay. Those Bolsheviks are going to rule the day. Cliff Notes version of the lecture. Here you go. March Revolution, Tsar is out because Russia's in a horrible shape. They didn't have peace. They didn't have land. They didn't have bread. Two governments put in after that. Are two groups of people with conflicting ideas. Kreisky's in the lead, puts in a government you would see basically anywhere else in Europe. And the Soviets are gaining more and more power. Soviets, remember those local councils of workers that are gaining more and more power. And when Lenin gets sent back to Russia by the Germans, he's going to basically consolidate power around those Soviets through his Bolshevik Party. The Bolshevik Party then takes over in a bloodless coup in November, takes out the Tsar, and gets the Russians out of the war, which will help the Germans, but too little, too late.